Have you ever felt the pressure to defend yourself, even when you knew the truth was already standing with you? There was a night I learned to stop explaining myself. It wasn't dramatic at first. No thunder, no shouting, no public humiliation. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes after people have already made up their minds about you. The kind of silence that feels like a courtroom where you are both the accused and the only witness willing to speak. I remember sitting in a dimly lit room, the glow from my phone screen fading in and out as messages stopped coming in. Earlier that evening, words had been exchanged. Not loud words, not violent words, but words heavy enough to tilt perception, and perception is dangerous. Because once people decide who you are, they stop listening to who you are becoming. I replayed every sentence in my head. Maybe I could have said it better. Maybe I should have clarified more. Maybe if I send one more message. Maybe if I explain again. Maybe if I defend myself clearly this time. Maybe they'll understand. Have you ever lived in that? Maybe if I explain my heart better, they won't think I'm proud. Maybe if I defend my silence, they won't think I'm guilty. Maybe if I justify my boundaries, they won't call me selfish. Maybe if I soften my strength, they won't call me difficult. That night, I drafted paragraphs I never sent. Long explanations, detailed clarifications, carefully worded defenses. Each one felt righteous. Each one felt necessary. And yet, something inside me was unsettled. Not because I was wrong, but because I was exhausted from trying to manage other people's understanding. Exhausted from trying to curate how I was perceived. Exhausted from trying to prove a heart that heaven had already validated. The room felt smaller as the night grew deeper. The fan hummed softly above me. Outside, distant car tires rolled over asphalt. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary night. But inside, there was a storm. I felt misunderstood. I felt unseen. I felt misjudged. And something in me wanted to fight it. Not with anger, but with explanation. Because explanation feels noble. It feels mature. It feels like clarity. But sometimes, explanation is just fear wearing a polite voice. Fear of being rejected. Fear of being misrepresented. Fear of losing connection. Fear of not being believed. I opened my Bible almost mechanically. Not because I was calm. Not because I was spiritual in that moment, but because I was tired of my own thoughts. And that's when it happened. Not fireworks. Not an audible voice. Just a moment. A line I had read many times before suddenly felt alive. It wasn't presented to me as a quote on a page. It was a mirror. It was the image of Jesus standing before accusation and not defending himself. The scene unfolded in my mind like a film. A governor's hall, religious leaders whispering, crowds restless, charges thrown like stones. And there he stood, falsely accused, misunderstood, misrepresented, and when given the chance to speak, he was quiet. The weight of that moment hit me differently that night, because silence in the face of accusation feels like weakness to us. But in that hall, silence was authority. It wasn't that he had no defense. It was that he didn't need one. There is a kind of strength that does not rush to explain itself. There is a kind of confidence that does not tremble when misunderstood. There is a kind of identity that does not panic when misjudged. And I realized something uncomfortable. The reason I felt desperate to explain myself wasn't because truth needed my help. It was because my ego wanted control. If I can just control how they see me. If I can just control the narrative. If I can just control their opinion, then I can feel safe. But safety built on other people's understanding is fragile. That night, I saw something deeper. Every time I over-explain, I am unconsciously asking people to validate what God has already affirmed. Every time I rush to defend, I am subtly saying, heaven's verdict is not enough for me. And that realization stung, because I thought I was being mature. I thought I was being responsible. I thought I was being clear. But beneath it, there was insecurity, the need to be seen correctly, the need to be approved, the need to be justified. There's nothing wrong with clarity, but there is something dangerous about constantly defending yourself to people who have already decided not to understand you. Some battles are not about truth. They are about control. And sometimes the most powerful move is not speaking louder, but stepping back. As the night deepened, I felt a quiet invitation rise in my spirit. Not a command. An invitation. What if you trusted me to defend you? That question unsettled me, because trusting God to defend you means surrendering the outcome. It means being okay with temporary misunderstanding. It means being okay with silence. It means being okay with not correcting every false perception immediately. And that feels terrifying if you have spent your life proving yourself. Maybe you grew up feeling unheard. Maybe you were blamed for things you didn't do. Maybe you were overlooked. Maybe you were labeled too much or not enough. So now, when accusation or misunderstanding appears, your reflex is defense. Not because you're prideful, but because you're tired of being misread. That was me. I wasn't trying to dominate anyone. I just didn't want to be falsely defined. But there is a deeper strength in definition. There is identity. And identity anchored in God does not shake when misinterpreted by people. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and did something radical. I deleted the drafts. All of them. Every long explanation. Every defensive paragraph. Every attempt to clarify myself into comfort. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before I pressed delete. It felt like surrender. It felt like loss. It felt like I was giving up my voice, but something unexpected happened. Peace. Not loud peace. Not emotional relief. Just a steady, grounded calm, as if heaven whispered, "I saw everything. I know the truth. That is enough." And for the first time in a long time, I allowed that to be enough. You see, when Jesus stood silent before accusation, it wasn't because he was weak. It was because his mission was bigger than their misunderstanding. He was not there to win an argument. He was there to fulfill purpose. Sometimes we waste energy defending ourselves in rooms we were never meant to be understood in. Not every space is assigned to validate you. Not every audience is called to comprehend your heart, and not every accusation requires your rebuttal. That night became a turning point, not because the situation instantly resolved. It didn't. People still believed what they wanted to believe. Some conversations never happened. Some clarifications were never received, but something inside me shifted. I stopped measuring my peace by other people's opinions. I stopped tying my worth to being correctly interpreted. I stopped chasing understanding. And I started resting in identity. There is an inner strength that awakens when you realize you do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. You do not have to defend every rumor. You do not have to respond to every misinterpretation. You do not have to clarify yourself into exhaustion. There is a time to speak, but there is also a time to be still. And that night, stillness became my weapon. It felt counterintuitive, but it felt right. And maybe this is where your story meets mine. Maybe you're in a season where people have misunderstood your silence. Maybe they've labeled your boundaries. Maybe they've questioned your motives. Maybe they've distorted your intentions. And everything in you wants to explain, to send the message, to schedule the call, to clear the air. Maybe God is whispering the same invitation he whispered to me. What if I am your defender? What if your silence is not weakness, but trust? What if your refusal to over-explain is not pride, but maturity? What if the need to justify yourself is the last chain holding you to human approval? That night, I learned something I had never truly practiced before. You don't need to convince everyone. You need to be aligned. Alignment with God will outlast misunderstanding from people. And when you understand that, something settles in your chest. You breathe differently. You respond differently. You carry yourself differently. You stop shrinking. You stop scrambling. You stop overperforming. The next morning did not come with applause. No one texted to apologize. No one called to say, "I see you now." No dramatic reversal. No public correction. Just ordinary daylight. And yet something inside me felt unfamiliar. I wasn't anxious. Usually, after conflict or misunderstanding, my mornings would start with a mental audit. Did they respond? Did they misunderstand that message? Should I clarify? Should I follow up? Should I fix it before it grows? That day, there was none of that. There was space. And in that space, I began to understand something deeper. Silence does not mean you don't care. It means you care more about truth than about perception. But here is the uncomfortable part. When you stop explaining yourself, people often become louder because your silence removes their ability to engage you in control. And that's when the tension intensifies. Later that week, I encountered subtle shifts. Tone changed. Distance appeared. Energy felt different. Not openly hostile, just colder. And I could feel the temptation rise again. Explain, clarify, correct, rescue the image. There is a strange addiction to being understood. It feels like oxygen, but oxygen can become suffocating if you depend on it from the wrong source. I found myself praying, not long prayers, but honest ones. God, if I stay quiet, will you really handle this? And that question reveals something vulnerable, because silence feels like risk. When you speak, you feel active. When you defend, you feel empowered. When you explain, you feel responsible. But when you surrender the narrative, you feel exposed. And exposure triggers fear that people will misjudge you permanently. Fear that doors will close. Fear that your reputation will suffer. Fear that you will be reduced to someone else's version of you. But there is something I began to notice. When Jesus stood before accusation and did not defend himself, Scripture says the governor was amazed. Not impressed by argument, not convinced by debate. Amazed by restraint carries weight. In a world where everyone is shouting their innocence, the person who stands secure in silence becomes unshakable. That morning I realized I had always equated strength with articulation. If I can explain it clearly, I'm strong. If I can defend it logically, I'm mature. If I can justify it calmly, I'm righteous. But strength is not always verbal. Sometimes strength is composure. Sometimes strength is letting people be wrong about you without feeling the need to interrupt them. And that sounds simple until you try it. Because being misunderstood touches something ancient inside us. As children, many of us learned that silence meant guilt, that if you didn't defend yourself quickly, the blame would stick, that if you didn't clarify immediately, you would be misjudged. So we grew into adults who over-explain, over-clarify, over-defend, over-justify. We do it politely. We do it spiritually. We do it with grace. But underneath, we're afraid of being seen incorrectly. And here's the truth that confronted me. If your identity is anchored in God, misinterpretation cannot erase you. It may delay recognition. It may shift perception. But it cannot rewrite who you are. I began to ask myself uncomfortable questions. Why does their opinion disturb me so deeply? Why does misunderstanding feel like injustice? Why do I feel responsible for managing their thoughts? And the answer was humbling. Because somewhere in me, I still wanted approval. Not maliciously, not desperately, but subtly. Approval feels safe. When people approve of you, doors feel open. Relationships feel stable. Reputation feels secure. But if approval becomes your anchor, disapproval becomes your storm, and storms reveal foundations. That week I experienced small storms, conversations that felt strained, moments of awkward silence, subtle exclusion. And every time the discomfort rose, I felt that internal fork in the road. Defend or trust, explain or rest, fix or release. Each time I chose silence, not passive silence, but surrendered silence. And that is where inner strength began to form. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. You see, when you stop explaining yourself, you are forced to confront yourself. Without the distraction of defending, without the noise of justification, without the adrenaline of argument, you are left alone with your motives. Was I truly right? Was my heart clean? Was my intention pure? Or was I just offended that someone didn't see me the way I see myself? Silence strips you. It removes performance. And in that stripping, God does something deeper. He refines identity. There is a verse that says, "He will bring forth your righteousness as the light." Notice the order. Not you will prove, not you will convince, not you will argue. He will bring forth, which means there is a timing to vindication. And timing requires patience, requires trust, requires surrender. And surrender feels like loss until you realize what you gain. What did I gain? Peace. Real peace. The kind that does not fluctuate based on people's moods. The kind that does not spike with praise or collapse with criticism. The kind that stays steady. And something unexpected happened. Over time, people began to reveal themselves. Some who distanced themselves were never aligned in the first place. Some who believed rumors quietly observed longer. Some who misunderstood eventually saw truth without my interference. And that was the revelation. Truth does not need panic. Truth does not need pressure. Truth stands. And if it is truly truth, it will surface. But here is where teaching meets your life. How many times have you exhausted yourself trying to correct every assumption? How many hours have you spent rehearsing conversations that never happened? How much emotional energy have you burned trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you? There is a difference between clarity and compulsion. Clarity is calm. Compulsion is anxious. Clarity says, "Let me explain this once." Compulsion says, "Let me explain it 10 different ways until you agree." And agreement is not the same as understanding. That realization changed how I approached conflict. I began to ask, have I said what is necessary? Have I spoken truth with love? Have I been honest and clean in my motive? If the answer was yes, then the rest was not my responsibility. And that is where many of us struggle, because we believe if the outcome is not resolved, we have failed. But you are not responsible for controlling other people's interpretations. You are responsible for your integrity is quiet confidence. It does not scramble. It does not overperform. It does not beg to be believed. It stands. And sometimes standing means being misunderstood for a season. That season tests you. It tests your ego. It tests your insecurity. It tests your need for validation. But it also strengthens your roots. There is something powerful about walking into a room where you know some people have the wrong story about you and still remaining composed. Not defensive, not cold, not withdrawn, just grounded. That grounding is authority is not loud. Authority is stable, and stability intimidates chaos. When you stop explaining yourself, you shift power. You move from reaction to alignment. You move from performance to presence. You move from proving to becoming. And here's what I learned the hard way. The more you explain yourself to people who don't want truth, the more you dilute your authority. Because constant defense communicates uncertainty. But calm restraint communicates conviction does not need to shout. It simply remains. And that week became a laboratory for that lesson. Each awkward interaction was an opportunity to either revert to old patterns or step into new maturity. It wasn't easy. Sometimes I would start typing a message, then delete it. Sometimes I would rehearse a conversation in my head, then choose silence in reality. Sometimes I would feel the urge to gather allies, to tell my side of the story. But I stopped, because explaining yourself to 10 people rarely fixes the one person who chose misunderstanding. Instead, it multiplies noise, and noise weakens clarity. So I began to cultivate something deeper, inner agreement with God. If He knows my heart, if He sees my intention, if He validates my integrity, then I can survive being misjudged. And maybe you're here right now because you're tired of defending, tired of clarifying, tired of proving, tired of managing perception. Maybe you feel like you're constantly on trial. But what if the courtroom has already been dismissed in heaven? What if the verdict has already been settled? What if you are exhausting yourself fighting battles that have already been decided above you? That week, I realized something that changed my posture. Not everyone deserves access to your explanation. Some people are not seeking understanding. They are seeking control. An explanation feeds control. Silence starves it. And when control is starved, truth has space to breathe. That realization did not make me cold. It made me calm. Because calm people do not rush. They move with intention. They speak when necessary. They release when finished. And they trust that what is planted in truth will eventually bloom in light. The shift inside me was subtle, but irreversible. I no longer feared being misunderstood. I feared losing alignment, because misunderstanding can be temporary, but misalignment can be costly. And that is when I began to sense something changing around me too. Conversations adjusted. Energy softened. Some tensions dissolved without discussion. Not because I argued, but because I stood. And that standing was not passive. It was rooted. It was grounded in something deeper than human approval. And the deeper I rooted, the less I felt the need to reach outward for validation. There is freedom in that. Freedom from narrative management. Freedom from over-explaining. Freedom from performance. And once you taste that freedom, you realize how heavy the old way was. But the story doesn't end there, because silence is only the beginning. What happened next required something even harder than not explaining. It required releasing, and that is where the true turning point began. Releasing is harder than silence is restraint. Releasing is surrender. Silence says, I will not defend myself. Releasing says, I will not resent you for misunderstanding me. And that is where the deeper work began. Because even after I stopped explaining myself outwardly, I was still arguing inwardly. Have you ever done that? You say nothing. You stay composed. You smile politely. But inside, you're replaying the entire case, rebuilding your argument, refining your defense, winning imaginary debates at 2 a.m. Silence without release becomes suppressed frustration. And suppressed frustration always finds a way to leak. In tone, in distance, in subtle coldness, in passive withdrawal. I noticed it in myself. Externally, I looked strong. Internally, I was still tight, still offended, still rehearsing, still hoping that one day the perfect opportunity would arise where I could finally clear it up. And that's when another layer of truth surfaced. It wasn't just about trusting God to defend me. It was about trusting God to deal with them. That's where most of us hesitate, because we don't just want God to defend us. We want Him to expose them. We want Him to correct them, to convict them, to make them realize, to send a dramatic revelation. We want justice that feels visible. But heaven's justice does not always perform on our timeline, and that's uncomfortable. There was a moment, another quiet one, where I sensed the Spirit whisper something even deeper than before. Let me be your defender, and let me be their teacher. That hit differently, because when you hold on to offense, you subtly position yourself as judge. You decide what they deserve. You decide when they should learn. You decide how they should apologize. And that position is heavy. It drains you. Releasing means stepping out of that seat. It means saying, God, I trust you with this completely. Not just my reputation, but their growth. That is next-level maturity. And it is painful, because release feels like loss of leverage. If I don't hold on to this, who will make sure it's corrected? If I don't stay alert, who will protect me? If I don't guard myself tightly, won't this happen again? But here's what I discovered. Bitterness feels like protection, but it is actually imprisonment. When you replay what they did, you relive it. When you rehearse what they said, you reopen it. When you hold on to how it felt, you re-anchor it. Release is not denial. It is permission for God to work without your interference. And I had to learn the difference between wisdom and woundedness. Wisdom says, adjust your boundaries. Woundedness says, shut everyone out. Wisdom says, discern carefully. Woundedness says, trust no one. Wisdom is calm. Woundedness is reactive. So I asked myself hard questions. Am I silent because I trust God? Or am I silent because I am shutting down? Am I releasing this? Or am I storing it for later? It took honesty to admit that part of me still wanted validation from the very people who misunderstood me. That's humbling, because we often pretend we've moved on, while secretly hoping for recognition. But healing requires clean motives. And clean motives require letting go of hidden expectations. I remember one afternoon, weeks later, walking alone just before sunset. The sky was soft, gold melting into blue, and I felt something rise in me again. Not anger, not even sadness, just a quiet ache. The ache of knowing that some relationships shift permanently, that some misunderstandings don't get resolved, that some people will hold a version of you that no longer fits. And that's when the teaching blended with the story in a way that reshaped me. Jesus didn't just stay silent before accusation. He also didn't chase the crowd afterward. He didn't run after those who doubted. He didn't campaign for better perception. He didn't force clarity. He fulfilled purpose absorbs misunderstanding. Purpose outlives rumor. Purpose does not pause to manage opinion. And that's when something settled in me fully. If I am aligned with purpose, I can survive misinterpretation. Because purpose anchors identity deeper than perception ever could. And here is where your life intersects again. How many of you have paused your calling because someone misunderstood you? How many of you shrank your voice because someone labeled you? How many of you altered your boundaries because someone called you difficult? How many of you over-explained your growth to people committed to your past? There is a version of you that others are comfortable with. And when you outgrow that version, friction appears. Sometimes the misunderstanding isn't even malicious. It's discomfort. People often misinterpret growth as betrayal. When you change, they must adjust. And not everyone wants to adjust. So they explain you instead. She thinks she's better. She's distant now. He's prideful. She's different. And sometimes, you are different. But different doesn't mean wrong. Growth always disrupts old narratives. And when you stop explaining your growth to those attached to your old self, you step into authority does not apologize for maturity. Authority does not beg to be understood. Authority moves. And that's what I began to do. I didn't cut people off dramatically. I didn't make announcements. I didn't post statements. I simply shifted my energy. Less proving, more purpose. Less managing, more building. Less defending, more becoming. And here's what happens when you do that. The people who are aligned with your future lean in. The people attached to your past lean away. And that sorting is not cruelty. It's clarity. Release creates clarity, creates freedom, creates strength. And strength changes how you pray. Because up until that point, my prayers had been defensive. God, fix this. God, make them see, protect my image. But after release, my prayers shifted. God, refine me. God, guard my heart. God, align me with what's next. That shift is powerful because when you stop focusing on what they're thinking, you gain energy to focus on who you're becoming. And becoming requires space that over-explaining steals, space that bitterness consumes, space that resentment suffocates. But when you release, you reclaim space. And that space becomes fertile ground for inner strength. Is not loud. It is stable. It doesn't spike with praise. It doesn't collapse with criticism. It remains. And remaining is powerful. One of the hardest truths I faced was this. Sometimes you won't get closure, no apology, no acknowledgement, no public correction, just quiet distance. And you must decide whether you need closure from people or peace from God. Because you cannot force both. If you chase closure, you risk losing peace. If you choose peace, you may never get closure. But peace is better. Peace does not depend on someone else's realization. Peace is anchored internally. When that anchor sets deep enough, something transformative happens. You stop trying to control narratives. You stop replaying scenarios. You stop scanning for subtle shifts. You live, fully, grounded, unapologetic. And that freedom is visible. People can sense it. Not because you announce it, but because you carry differently. Your posture changes. Your speech slows. Your reactions soften. You're no longer reacting to perception. You are responding from identity. And identity is quiet confidence. But the story was not finished yet, because eventually there comes a moment when silence and release meet confrontation. Not aggressive confrontation, but a moment where you must decide. Will I step into the new version of myself fully? Or will I shrink back to keep comfort? That moment arrived unexpectedly. And it became the turning point where prayer and declaration were no longer optional. They were necessary, because sometimes growth provokes resistance. And when resistance appears, you must speak, not to defend your ego, but to declare your alignment. And that is where everything shifted from internal strength to spiritual authority. The moment came quietly, not in an argument, not in a dramatic showdown, not in a public confrontation. It came in a simple interaction. A tone, a look, a sentence loaded with assumption. The old version of me would have felt heat rise instantly. The old version would have prepared a speech, a clarification, a defense layered with proof. But this time, something was different. There was no panic. There was awareness. I recognized the fork in the road immediately. Defend or stand. Prove or declare. Shrink or step fully into the version of myself that no longer begs to be understood. And that's when I understood something deeper than all the lessons before. Silence teaches you restraint. Release teaches you trust, but declaration establishes authority. There comes a point where you no longer explain yourself. You simply state who you are, not aggressively, not defensively, not emotionally, just clearly. And clarity without apology is powerful. In that moment, instead of explaining my intentions, I responded calmly. I'm comfortable with the decision I made. That was it. No paragraph, no justification, no evidence, no over-detailing, just grounded truth. And something shifted in the atmosphere, because when you stop scrambling for validation, people feel the weight of your certainty unsettles insecurity. And insecurity often tries to provoke reaction. But when there is no reaction to feed on, it quiets. I walked away from that interaction not feeling victorious, but feeling anchored. And that's when the prayer inside me changed completely. It was no longer, God, defend me. It became, God, establish me. There is a difference. Defense removes attack. Establishment builds foundation. And when God establishes you, accusation loses its impact. That night, I prayed differently than I ever had before in this situation. Not from hurt, not from frustration, but from authority. Father, you are my defender. You are my vindicator. You are the one who sees what is hidden and knows what is true. If there is anything in me that needs correction, refine it. If there is pride in me, remove it. If there is insecurity in me, uproot it. But if I am aligned with you, establish me so deeply that misunderstanding cannot shake me. And then something bold rose in me. Declarations, not emotional ones, grounded ones. I will not over-explain what God has already confirmed. I will not defend what heaven has already settled. I will not chase validation from those who are not assigned to affirm me. I will not shrink to fit comfort. I will not dilute my growth to protect someone else's perception. That was the turning point. Because when you speak from identity instead of insecurity, you feel it in your body. Your shoulders relax. Your breathing steadies. Your eyes soften. You are no longer in survival mode. You are standing in sonship, in daughterhood, in alignment. And that is where authority lives. Authority is not loud. Authority is certain. Authority does not need applause. Authority does not need agreement. Authority simply remains. And I began to notice something almost ironic. The less I explained myself, the less tension followed me. The more I stood calmly, the more the narrative lost power, the less perception consumed me. It was as if heaven had been waiting for me to let go. Not so God could fight harder, but so I could stand stronger. You see, when you constantly explain yourself, you position yourself beneath the accusation. But when you stand without scrambling, you rise above it. That does not mean you become arrogant. It means you become aligned. And alignment is immovable. Now let me speak directly to you. Some of you are exhausted, not because you're wrong, but because you are over-defending what God is already growing. Some of you are tired, not because you lack clarity, but because you are trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. Some of you are emotionally drained, not because you are weak, but because you are fighting battles that are not assigned to you. Listen carefully. You do not need to attend every argument you are invited to. You do not need to correct every rumor. You do not need to respond to every tone. You do not need to prove every intention. There is a higher court, and once you accept that the highest court has already ruled in your favor, peace becomes your posture. But peace does not mean passivity. Peace means stability, and stability changes how you walk into rooms. It changes how you handle silence. It changes how you process rejection. It changes how you view delay. Because when you stop explaining yourself, something sacred happens. You begin to hear yourself more clearly. You begin to recognize your own voice without distortion. You begin to trust your discernment. You begin to respect your boundaries. And that respect teaches others how to approach you. There is a version of you that explains everything, and there is a version of you that simply lives in truth. The first is exhausting. The second is powerful. That night, the original night, I thought I was losing something. I thought I was surrendering control. I thought I was risking misunderstanding. I thought silence meant vulnerability. But looking back now, I see it differently. That was the night I stopped performing. That was the night I stopped negotiating my identity. That was the night I stepped into authority over my reactions, authority over my need for approval, authority over my narrative. And here is the beautiful part. When you stop explaining yourself to the wrong people, you create space for the right ones to recognize you. Not because you convinced them, but because you remained consistent. Consistency reveals truth over time. Time exposes distortion. Time affirms integrity. Time vindicates alignment. You don't need instant validation. You need sustained character. And sustained character is built in seasons of misunderstanding. So tonight, if you find yourself in that space again, misunderstood, misread, mislabeled, I want you to pause before you type. Pause before you defend. Pause before you justify. Pause before you scramble. Ask yourself, have I been honest? Have I been aligned? Have I spoken truth clearly? If yes, then release the rest. Stand, pray, declare, and walk forward. Because the night you stop explaining yourself is not the night you become silent. It is the night you become secure. And security is contagious. People may not understand you immediately, but they will feel the difference. They will sense the calm. They will see the steadiness. They will recognize the growth. And some will adjust. Some will leave. And some will come, but you will remain. And maybe, just maybe, this is your night too. The night you stop explaining. The night you stop proving. The night you stop shrinking. The night you step fully into who God already confirmed you to be. So let me leave you with this question. If heaven has already validated you, why are you still defending yourself on earth?